He grew up in a cramped apartment in the Bronx, sharing a single room with his brothers, wearing hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit. His name was Ralph Lifshitz, and at that time, nothing about his life suggested he would become Ralph Lauren. No money, no connections, no formal training, just a kid surrounded by limitations most people never escape. And yet, decades later, that same name, now known around the world, would sit on billion-dollar stores, worn by presidents, Hollywood icons, and Olympic athletes. But here's what makes this story different. It almost didn't happen. One decision, one refusal nearly destroyed everything before it even began. Because this isn't just a story about fashion. It's about a moment where he was offered security and walked away from it. If you're into real stories of power, money, and transformation, subscribe, because what happened next didn't just build a brand, it forced the world to adapt to his vision. And to understand how that moment became possible, we have to go back before the name, before the brand, to a small apartment in the Bronx, where none of this was supposed to happen. 1. Humble beginnings. He was born in October of 1939, the youngest of 4 children in a family that had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. His parents arrived in the United States with hope, but very little else. His father painted houses for a living, earning just enough to keep food on the table, while his mother stretched every dollar like it might be the last. They lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, where space was so limited that privacy didn't exist, and comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. His name was Ralph Lifshitz, though one day the world would come to know him as Ralph Lauren. But even in that environment, something about him was different. While other kids focused on escaping their neighborhood through sports or street culture, he became obsessed with something far less practical: elegance. Every Saturday, he would stand outside movie theaters, not to follow the stories, but to study the actors' clothing. Perfectly tailored suits, polished shoes, the way confidence seemed stitched into every detail. It wasn't just fashion to him, it was transformation. It was proof that identity could be constructed, even if your reality told you otherwise. By the age of 12, he had already made his first bold move. Using money from small jobs, he bought himself a 3-piece suit. It wasn't expensive, and it certainly didn't match the wealth he admired, but it changed how people saw him, and more importantly, how he saw himself. In a neighborhood where image often meant survival, he realized that style could be a form of power. That realization would quietly shape every decision he made afterward, long before he ever touched the fashion industry. But there was a problem, and it wasn't financial. It was personal. His last name made him a target. In a rough environment where standing out could be dangerous, he was constantly mocked. The bullying wasn't occasional, it was relentless. And what happened next would define his entire future. At just 16 years old, Ralph Lifshitz made a decision that most teenagers would never dare to make. He erased the name that made him a target, and Ralph Lauren was born. 2. The first reinvention. At just 16 years old, he changed his last name. It wasn't a small adjustment, it was a complete rejection of the identity he had been born into. The new name sounded more refined, more American, more aligned with the world he wanted to enter. This wasn't about hiding, it was about positioning. In that moment, Ralph Lauren understood something most people don't grasp until much later. Perception shapes opportunity. In high school, his reputation began to shift. While other students dressed like teenagers, he dressed like someone preparing for a future they couldn't yet see. He worked part-time jobs, saved money, and spent it not on entertainment, but on clothing that reflected the life he imagined. At the same time, he started selling handmade ties to classmates, testing an idea without even realizing it. After graduation, he briefly attended college to study business, but it didn't last. The structure of formal education felt too slow, too disconnected from what he wanted to build. He dropped out and eventually served in the military, where he absorbed something unexpected: discipline. That experience would later shape the precision behind everything he created. When he returned to civilian life, He entered the fashion world from the lowest possible position selling ties. He wasn't designing yet. He was observing. But the more he learned, the clearer it became. The system rewarded conformity, and he was never going to fit into that. 3. Rejection and risk. At 28 years old, Ralph Lauren made his first real bet. He pitched an idea that went directly against the market wider, more expressive ties inspired by European style. The response was immediate. Rejection. Not because it lacked quality, but because it didn't fit what was already selling. And in an industry built on trends, going against the current was seen as a mistake. But to him, it felt like an opportunity. So he walked away. No safety net, no guarantee, just a borrowed $50,000 and a belief that he was right. He started small, working out of a single drawer, handling everything himself. Designing, selling, delivering. Every day depended on whether someone said yes or no. And most of the time, the answer was no. The pressure wasn't abstract, it was financial, immediate, and constant. Then came the opportunity that could change everything. A major department store wanted his ties. It was the kind of deal that could legitimize his entire business overnight. But there was a condition. Change the product and remove his label. In exchange, he'd get exposure and stability. For someone in his position, it was the safest move he could make. But there was a problem. Saying yes meant giving up control. So he said no. He walked away from the one deal that could have saved him. And for months, it looked like he had made the wrong decision. 4. The breakthrough. What followed wasn't immediate success, it was uncertainty. Sales slowed, pressure increased, and doubt started to build. This is where most people pivot, where they adjust, compromise, adapt to survive. But Ralph Lauren didn't. He stayed consistent, even when the results didn't support him. Then something shifted. The same store that had rejected his terms came back. Not out of generosity, but necessity. They couldn't find anything like his product anywhere else. The difference he refused to change had become his advantage. This time, they accepted everything: his design, his label, his identity. That moment wasn't just a sale. It was proof that the market can resist something and then suddenly demand it. Within a year, his ties were generating hundreds of thousands in revenue. A massive leap for a brand that had started from nothing. And that's when everything expanded. He moved beyond ties into full menswear, building a complete aesthetic instead of a single product. He wasn't just selling clothing anymore. He was creating a world people wanted to belong to. 5. Empire and legacy. Growth came fast, and with it, new risks. As demand increased, operations struggled to keep up, deliveries failed, finances tightened, and for the first time, success itself became a threat. Talent had built the brand, but it wasn't enough to sustain it. So he made another critical decision. Ralph Lauren invested everything he had back into the company and brought in partners who understood the business side. That shift from doing everything alone to building a structure allowed the brand to scale without collapsing. From there, expansion became strategic. The brand moved into fragrances, home collections, and global retail. What started as ties became a lifestyle empire. By the 1980s and 90s, his designs were everywhere from Wall Street to Hollywood, generating billions and shaping what American luxury looked like. But even then, the story didn't stabilize. Years later, overexpansion weakened the brand, forcing another reset. And once again, the same principle applied: protect the vision. Today, Ralph Lauren remains a global powerhouse, not just because of what he built, but because of what he refused to change. From a cramped Bronx apartment to a global empire worth billions, Ralph Lauren didn't just build a brand, he built an identity. So here's the real question. Would you have walked away from that deal when everything depended on it? And more importantly, do you have a vision strong enough to bet everything on? Subscribe for more stories like this, because the next empire might start exactly where you least expect it.